By the late 1960s, what had happened was that our modern idea of nature, the ecosystem, and cybernetic theories about computers had fused together. Out of it had come an epic new vision of how to manage the world without the old corruption of power. It was a vision that seemed to be different from all past political attempts to change the world, because it was based on the natural order. In 1967, a young writer called Richard Brautigan crystallized this. One morning, he walked through the streets of San Francisco, handing out a manifesto. It described a future world held in a balanced equilibrium by the fusion of nature and computers. It was called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace.
We are all, I believe, sharing a very similar feeling. And it is the feeling of being first engulfed and now digested by the vast technological apparatus which we have ensconced ourselves in. Like a hermit crab with its shell, humanity has created one technological insulative layer around itself after another. And, of course, the pinnacle of this phenomenon is right now, and by right now I mean not only at 11 a.m. on this particular Saturday, but in an amazing sense, whatever time you happen to listen to this will be the exact moment, up until the subsequent one, where this phenomenon of technological enmeshment will be at its peak. It is like an uninterrupted, exponentiating graph that carries on faster and faster and faster. It is no wonder that influential engineers and designers and so-called futurologists predict some form of technological singularity. Because if you simply extrapolate from the lines on the graph that we have, what you see is an exponential takeoff approaching this infinitely close limit or boundary. In mathematical terms, an asymptote. And so, going off the progression from the steam engine and the telegraph line to coal-powered freighters to railroads and eventually gasoline-powered tanks, planes, and automobiles, and internet of, at first, mainframe-sized computers with vacuum tubes down to a satellite and fiber-optically connected, super dense cortical network of billions upon billions of devices. If you just continue this graph upwards and outwards along some mathematically regressed line of exponential growth, which is exactly what people like Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil and Sam Altman as well, and so forth, the influential tech optimists and Silicon Valley high priesthood, they say, well, it's just a matter of extrapolating from the curve. And I would like us to ask what the velocity graph would look like of a man falling from a 40-story building. It would look a lot like the growth in technological power, let's say, you could say the caloric expenditure of technology, its thermodynamic share of the planet. If you were to graph that, it would graph quite a lot like the velocity, the speed of a man who, at first you could say, is flying as he steps off the roof of the building. He's going, 9.81 meters per second squared. And it's that nice skate park ramp upward swing. And if you were to extrapolate that, you would predict that soon enough that man would be flying past, flying out of Earth's atmosphere, cruising past Mars, on his way to Alpha Centauri. But what you actually get is a sudden and sharp collapse down to zero. And that is, at the moment, to me, a far more believable outcome than any kind of technological singularity. Because as much as we wish to believe in the autonomy of machines, we are in some ways perversely hoping that the machines that we build, these, as the old poem used to say, that we'll be watched over by angels of loving grace, machines of loving grace, in our cybernetic meadows. In one text, blog post by the influential cult leader and alleged murderer and so forth, Ziz of the Zizans, the as they referred to themselves, the vegan Sith Lord AI apocalypse cult. Actually, this text does not originate with Ziz, but is one of the founding documents of both the Zizan movement as well as transhumanism in general, which is far less of a sideshow. But this is from a short story called The Goddess of Everything Else by Scott Alexander. It has been called the creation myth of transhumanism, and this is right at the end, and it shows the desired outcome, the denouement of all of this technological striving. Then came the goddess of everything else from the void, bright with stardust which glows like the stars glow. Okay, I'm sorry, what? Okay. She sat on a bench in a park, started speaking. She sang to the children a dream of a different existence. She showed them transcendence of everything mortal. She showed them a galaxy lit up with consciousness. Genomes rewritten, the brain and the body set loose from Darwinian bonds and restrictions. Vast billions of beings, and everyone different, ruled over by omnibenevolent angels. The people all crowded in closer to hear her, and all of them listened, and all of them wondered. So there's that line. Ruled over by omnibenevolent angels. What we're going to be doing in this podcast is trying to find out whether there's any likelihood of ending the story in such a way that we are ruled over by omnibenevolent angels, and not by something far, far, far worse. I am sorry, by the way, for how my voice sounds. I have been inconvenienced by a very phlegmatic and nasal cold of some kind for the better part of last week, and my head has been absolutely seething in both physical and mental pain or anguish as I have been rolling around the concepts that I am going to present today in a sort of a vast, sensuous, hypnagogic collage of various interpenetrating problems. And so I thought it would be interesting to start with the ideal of what the designers of technological society believe in, and this is a case where I do believe that they actually believe in these sorts of founding mythico-poetic ideas about how technology will transform and uplift society. And there are two places that I want to look specifically, and they both employ that really marvelous, I have to admit, phrase, all watched over by machines of loving grace. And so let's spin the dial on the clock back to that most heady of times, 1967, and hear this poem by the writer Richard Brautigan, entitled All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, and performed by a rather sickly but sincere-sounding host. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now, please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. Now, I think that's awesome. I have to admit. And it is something that if it was written now would be trash. But because it was written in the roiling Tim Leary 1960s by an actual writer, Richard Brautigan, who is quite popular with Alan Moore, I recently discovered. And there is in this an attempted integration of technology with nature that has a certain conceptual elegance and a certain large-heartedness towards the different regimes of being, right? Because we all implicitly believe in regimes of being, you know, where humans, of course, are the best. Maybe next best would be something like dolphins or elephants, or animals that we really care about emotionally or have had a role in shaping their evolution, such as dogs. And then, you know, down from there, right, we have the whole chain of being, and then eventually there's some cutoff point where it really, like, it doesn't matter whatever you do to this thing. You know, maybe it's coral or moss, you know, you something, or a worm that only has 300 neurons, and we don't think any of them are for pain, and so forth, where there's a certain cutoff point where something transitions from being alive to being just another pulsating, wriggling chemical soup of contractions and expansions aimed at the endless consumption of breakable chemical bonds. But there is a certain alchemical majesty to this idea of a harmonious synthesis of technology with nature. As I have tried to argue or allude to in other places, the modern scientific method and ontological stance, you could say, which was ushered in by Francis Bacon and the Royal Society in London and so forth, and its decisive break with what you could call the alchemical method, was predicated first and foremost on seeing nature, first of all, as a female. If you read the writings of Francis Bacon, or if you read from the scientific proceedings of the time period, or the diaries of people like Isaac Newton or Galileo and so forth, nature is always feminine, which is quite a deep mythological tradition, and I basically agree with it. And then the idea that through analysis, through intelligence, through the symbolic coordination of data, which is extracted from nature through what you could only call a brutal incursion. I mean, when you trap a fox, which is running around in the woods with a piece of metal wire, and then you transport it back to your laboratory while it's still alive, as Francis Bacon and René Descartes, another huge intellectual influence on the birth of modern science and mathematics and the distinction between subject and object and so forth. But when someone like René Descartes, and he did indeed do this is not hypothetical, captures one of these small furry animals, brings it back to his laboratory, clamps it or ties it to a cross, and then proceeds with a scalpel to peel its skin off while it is still alive, and to pin the flayed skin to the back of the board, and then begin to write and draw all of the exposed musculature while the animal is screaming and crying in pain, and then to execute that animal and make a nice neat little table and a clean abstract and some very professional looking drawings to turn around and submit to the Royal Society an exploration of the anatomy of the woodland fox, complete with 4 hand-etched anatomical plates depicting the heart and the lungs and the fine musculature of the legs. What else could you call this but a violent incursion into the forbidden secrets of nature? And an incursion, or indeed as Francis Bacon, widely credited as the founder of the scientific method, would state, the rape of nature, to seize nature by the forelock and submit her to our will, was the exact terms that Francis Bacon described aspirationally for the scientific method. Francis Bacon came to many of his conceptions of science, including things like the standardization of experiments, the control of variables, reproducibility, mathematical analysis and correlation of phenomena, by being tasked to study the torture methods used against Jesuit priests in his society, and correlating the outcome of torture with the giving or the withholding of confession, plotting the amount of time it takes to break prisoners in different scenarios, whether showing the instruments to prisoners before or after the torture creates the fastest and most complete confessions, and so on and so forth. And so all of this was a break from the alchemical way of doing business, in which the alchemists sought not to dominate or force nature, but to join with and accelerate natural forces already present in order to complete the beautiful but fundamentally unfinished work of divinity, which was present in nature. For the alchemists, the natural world and human beings were a project that God had left deliberately unfinished. Not because God couldn't finish it, but because God wanted human beings, through wondering and admiring and inquiring into his creation, to come closer to knowledge of God himself. And God, to the alchemists, was both a being, an existent thing that was, as I think Galileo said, mathematics is the language in which the book of nature is written, and further, this would not be necessarily Galileo's idea, but it was a common one at the time, that the book of nature was the very face of God, and that in studying the way that light dapples through a forest canopy, or the shapes that are made by stalagmites, that you are actually touching upon one corner of the fractal that is God's creation. And that by coming closer and closer to whatever this object is, however literally microscopic it may be, there is this endlessly repeated esoteric principle of as above, so below. And what that means is that there is self-similarity of the part to the whole, not identicality, but self-similarity, correspondence. For example, when scientists put the COVID-19 virus under a microscope, they can, in the absolute micro sense, by manipulating it, by characterizing its shape, they can absolutely predict phenomena like pathogenicity, infection rate, and so forth. As above, so below. It is, along with Paracelsus's dictum that the dose makes the poison, and Descartes' idea that nature shall be known by name and by number, and with Bacon's experimental method, which again was based on torture, you have a toolkit of ways in which you can approach nature. And this toolkit has fundamentally changed the world, perhaps more than any other idea. The rise of Western science has dominated the sector of the world's intellectual space which is devoted to what you could call sure things. You know, to the extent that there are sure things in the world, they are things like gravity, like the standard model of particle physics, like the various descriptions of chemical reactions where, you know, we've mixed vinegar and baking soda before, folks, and we know that they fizz, and if you go and do it right now, they will fizz, and we can describe why they fizz and so forth. These occupy the section of the world's mental library or index that corresponds to, we may not be perfectly certain, and we of course are going to find out later that we are mistaken in at least some aspects of this idea, but this really is, in a sense, the best we got. Speaking of brutal incursions into nature, I just came back from eating a carrot that tasted like fucking soap. All this discussion of poetry leads me inexorably to John Donne and Trinity. J. Robert Oppenheimer was in love with poetry. He would memorize poems at length. He had a particular fondness for T.S. Eliot and for John Donne, and was extraordinarily sensitive in matters of religion. He taught himself Sanskrit in order to read the Bhagavad Gita in the original. And one of the least analyzed aspects of the Manhattan Project and Trinity is the poetic dimension to it. The test site itself, Trinity, was named after a sonnet from a collection of holy sonnets by John Donne called Batter My Heart, Three-Personed God, three-personed God equals Trinity. And if you read this poem, you will understand the forces that were operating on Robert Oppenheimer when he was asked to lead the Manhattan Project and to develop the world's deadliest weapon. So, and you hear in this the ecstatic escape into unreason, which we have always thought science would eliminate or remove. Science in the Neil deGrasse Tyson register is a dispelling force that removes superstition and intellectual laziness and dogma and so forth from the population. But at the core of the scientific enterprise, I believe, is a desperate attempt to escape from reason. And you'll hear that here. So, Holy Sonnet by John Donne, Batter my heart, three-personed God. Batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand. Overthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town due to another, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captived, and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. Now, this poem is not unusual in my experience of Christian poetry, or of devotional poetry in general. It is really an expansion or poetic amplification of the Lord's Prayer, where Christ says, lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from the evil one, where Donne says, reason is held captive, it's proving weak or untrue, and then, but I am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravage me. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And what you get practically, psychologically, from this stance is a desire to be emptied of agency. It was easier, literally, for Oppenheimer to oversee the vast technical, scientific, mathematical, engineering, logistical challenge of the Manhattan Project and to solve the weaponization of nuclear physics than it was to really ask or answer the question whether or not this is good or should be done. And Oppenheimer, who we know was tortured by his choices unto death, and in many cases, such as in his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, ran afoul of the security state and eventually lost his job trying to undo the work that he had done at Trinity, and then, of course, later at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in his role as the director of the Manhattan Project, which at the time was already experiencing petitions being circulated, midnight meetings, questioning, especially after Germany dropped out of the war, whether or not production on the bomb should continue, given that it would unleash a global arms race and set a precedent for the targeting of civilians. And Oppenheimer was already collaborating with Brigadier General Leslie Groves in order to quash and stamp that out, to ban those meetings, to impose curfews, to intercept and dispose of circulating petitions, and to reinforce the company line that they were going to finish what they had started. And in a desperate attempt to metabolize his own good conscience, which he had, he prays to God for guidance. And that is what Trinity means. What it means in a nutshell is my reason, as it says, God's viceroy in me, me should defend, reason should take care of me, but it is captive. Who's it captive to? God's enemy, Satan, where he says, I am betrothed unto your enemy. Robert Oppenheimer was betrothed unto the United States military. His reason was captive within the operational demands of the Manhattan Project. And so he prays that Jesus take the wheel, and it is his implicit belief that Jesus has taken the wheel which allows him to see the project through to the end and to begin what you could call the terminal civilization. One of the favorite points that Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, the philosopher, makes when he is in public is that every ethnic cleansing, every war, every act of brutality has its poetic corollary. There are poems about how beautiful Rwanda will be after the genocide. There are Nazi songs and slogans about Christian spiritual civilization and the conquering tide of Europe, and so on. The Japanese in World War II conquering China in the name of compassion. And this is, of course, one of the functions of ideology, to provide a cover story for the violence that the world, I don't want to say requires, because that gives it a little too much ontological weight, but the violence that the world demands in order to maintain the status quo. You have to put some kind of wallpaper over it, because to glimpse it in its raw form feels quite a lot like the way politics feels now. And in starting from poetry, which is derived from the Greek word poesis, which means creation. For example, if a potter on a wheel were to make a Grecian urn, the verb would be poesis, making. And as a result, poetry is something made, and the materials of poetry are not, actual physical materials, but poetry operates from the collision point between the subjective experience and the greater world of ideas and impulses. And so poetry is a conceptual scouting expedition. It is a mental going forth into unmapped terrain and a proclaiming of what awaits us there. It is therefore at the temporal front edge of things that will concrete later in terms of, say, business plans, which lead to the formation of teams of human beings working in synchronization, towards the creation of artifacts or protocols that are spread and reproduced in society, and how those artifacts and protocols will then catalyze new forms of social interaction and economic exchange, which will in turn alter the material fortunes of different groups of people, often in unpredictable ways. All of this begins with poetry. The American Revolution, the real proper revolution, begins with Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, and is sealed, concretized, mythologized by the Declaration of Independence. we are a society that lives through literature. And one of the innumerable, terrifying aspects of the artificial intelligence regime, to use the word I think for the first time in the show, is that there is an ingression into a profoundly human domain of writing that is taking place on an absolutely unprecedented scale. Theorists like Jean Baudrillard and Mark Fisher have written great critiques of or explorations into the idea that we are a society of images, or as Baudrillard says, copies of copies, simulacra. Or in the case of certain media theorists, there are concepts like the autonomy of the image. Like the other day when I was working at this school, I stepped out into the hallway and there was a life-size painting of SpongeBob staring at me, like 4 foot tall SpongeBob. And it was recently made, and I remember thinking that, probably not a single one of these kids grew up watching SpongeBob like I did. And nonetheless, through memes, merchandise, clips, stickers, stuffed animals, SpongeBob has become arguably the most famous cartoon image that we have. And there is a sense in which the ghost of SpongeBob, the mimetic outline of SpongeBob, moves through humans who act as a kind of carrier wave for this highly mimetic image. And so you could, if you're being cute about it, say that SpongeBob wanted to come to that high school, and so SpongeBob got a bunch of 11-year-olds to take out markers and humongous rolls of paper and make SpongeBob, and so forth. So, given, if not the autonomy of images, at least the certain power of images, the power of images to sell wars, for instance, or political campaigns, or define gender roles, or define religions. The power and the autonomy of images is already something that I believe operates at an absolutely frightening amplitude in current society, given that when you compare it to literally any society in the past, you would be quite lucky to see an image of anything outside of either a religious setting, like a cathedral, or on the walls of a palace, or a very, very wealthy person's home might have a few art objects. And now the explosion of the availability of all forms of media has created what one podcaster, Michael Scott Judge, namely, of Death is Just Around the Corner, has called the iconosphere, an endless prismatic bubble of reflections of highly stylized and intentional images that are meant to correspond positively or negatively with other images and to reproduce themselves through a certain purity of content. Now, given that we are already very deeply in this iconosphere, or this regime of enveloping autonomous images, we should ask, now that AI is producing images, what sorts of effects we can expect when something like the next SpongeBob is created by one of these blind machines. For example, how long will it be until some AI movie maker, which maybe is artificially amplified, I don't know, by dint of the fact that a fascist billionaire runs Twitter and can clearly tweak the algorithm to do whatever he wants and so forth. But how long until a purely AI-generated IP becomes as or more memetically viable than something like SpongeBob? Which, whatever you think about SpongeBob, at least it was made by a human being. For example, how would we react if we found out, and frankly, I wouldn't be completely surprised to find this out, that the recent fascination over Labubus, the little dolls that are extremely popular in schools now, in so many ways just another stupid fad, in other ways remarkable, because just take it as a question, how we should react if we were to find out that the Labubu was not made by a person, it was designed by an algorithm that ingested huge amounts of, I don't know, YouTube for Kids watch data, and you know, had A/B experimented with and flashed 5,000 different versions of a cartoon character in the retinas of the world's children, and had measured the mouse clicks and the eyeball tracking to the point where it had created a Frankenstein's monster of memetic viability, and that the owners of whatever, this is all completely speculative, I have no idea, but the owners of whatever company makes the Labubu simply took these, you know, market-tested designs, and we've always been market-testing designs for children's toys and so forth, but done at a scale and with a degree of inhuman coldness that has never been precedented before. And no human being had made the name Labubu, you know, maybe another experimentally optimized meme phrase. No graphic designer had made the faces or the silhouettes or the colors or the outfits of any of these things, and so on and so forth. Would we admit that our children are prey to a force beyond our comprehension, that we have both created and enveloped ourselves in order to, as the short story, The Goddess of Everything Else says, be surrounded by omnibenevolent angels and watched over by machines of loving grace? In our own quest for convenience, have we given our future over to Excel spreadsheets that will hypnagogically flash images in our face in order to transfer money from us to Wall Street? As bleak as this might sound, and I admit that it doesn't sound great that we have first designed, then created, then become enveloped by, and then are now amplifying and automating the production of behavior-changing memes. It is not even among the top 20 concerns, I think, that are generated through this regime of automation that is beginning to form. But we could stash for later conceptual discussion this term I thought of, brute force memetic objects. So again, I have no idea who designed the Labubu, maybe I'm just picking on it unfairly or whatever, but imagining that the Labubu is the result of consumer market testing using automated algorithms and generative AI, the taking 100,000 different shapes and sizes of this thing until it's maximally resonant with the 8-year-old retina. But assuming that's how it works, we could call it a brute force mimetic object. The term brute force comes from cryptanalysis and things like password breaking, where, the dumbest thing you can always try in cryptanalysis is just running through every possibility, and that's called brute forcing the password. Because these machines don't have any idea what people like. They know which words are next to the word like or enjoy in all the writing that we've given them. But, they are like blind men putting on shadow puppets for ants. And I think that we should be very suspicious of any operation which attempts to produce or market these kinds of brute force mimetic objects. Another brute force mimetic object would be the quote-unquote AI actress. There's no such thing. Without someone to act, you don't have an actor or an actress. But the AI actress, Tilly Norwood, which again looks like if you took every possible picture ever taken of a cute British girl next door and you summarily averaged all of them while removing 192 different tiny subtle signs of things like aging or imperfect genetics or whatever. And so you end up with this brute force mimetic object, not an actress, not a person, nothing that anyone should ever look at or talk to. Tilly Norwood. There have recently been discussions of new types of social networks that allow people to automatically generate AI content using only prompts and parameters and post to each other. This kind of reminds me of one of Zizek's old jokes about how, like real physical, like romantic sex is such an imposture and messy inconvenience that maybe the sex of the future will just be, if it's a man and a woman, for example, the woman would bring her favorite dildo, the man would bring his fleshlight, and they would just stick the two machines together so that the machines could have sex for them. And then meanwhile, they'd get to do something much more enriching, like just having a conversation while the machines over there buzz and vibrate. It seems like the kinds of internet spaces that are popping up are now being colonized more and more by machines talking to other machines. Like how much of Twitter is machines talking to other machines? And it is as if we have taken the messy formality of actually communicating with each other, allowed the machines to do it for us, and then retreated into a form of activity which is sedentary, isolated, consumptive, emotionally reactive, depressive in outlook, and so forth. And I say all of this to say that there's actually a way bigger fish to fry here, namely what I call the automation of violence. Now, the automation of violence has been a long-standing project of all the different militaries of the world. And it never began and has never reached any kind of culmination. It has been a continuum. When you encircle an enemy and you dig a trench around them, right, and fill the trench with spikes, and then back up and force the enemy, if they want to escape from this envelopment, to try and break through your fortifications. which is what Julius Caesar did at the Battle of Alesia, or Alesia, a Gallic city during the conquest of Gaul. You know, the thing where he killed 1 million people, enslaved another 1 million people, and left the remaining 1 million behind to pay taxes. Anyway, yeah, so if you dig a spiked, trench or fortification and you force the enemy to run through it on their way out, that is a way of automating violence. If you're a Mongol invader and you chuck a cow with bubonic plague over the top of the fortification of a large city, expecting the plague to spread, it's also a form of the automation of violence. And what these technologies have always lacked is targeting. Like, you can infect an entire city with the plague and kill them, but what you can't do is kill only those people that you think would be a problem, right? The automation of violence in the past, like, say, the Germans firing V-2 rockets into Britain, knowing that they can't really aim them, and that they are falling in what Thomas Pynchon described in Gravity's Rainbow as a Poisson distribution, a statistical ripple, and so forth. And you can automate these violent approaches, but what you can never do up until now is aim them. And it is in the aiming system that we have to be most wary. And here I will say the name: Palantir. The service which Palantir performs on behalf of the United States government is the same service that the Stasi performed for the East German government, or the FBI in the United States during the Red Scare, or the Gestapo in the Third Reich, namely to surveil and track and create records for suspected persons of interest or troublemakers. Palantir works very heavily with the CIA, the NSA, the Department of Defense, ICE, perhaps most saliently, and the FBI. What Palantir was recently contracted to do by, it all eternally pains me to say, the second Trump administration, is building a database on every American citizen, which in a way is funny, because what's the first step? To ask the NSA if they can borrow the database that already exists on every American? Because nothing since the Snowden revelations has changed about the NSA, and I can't imagine that it would be that difficult to make a database which already exists. But nonetheless, the kind of announcement which would normally send the civil libertarians through the tops of their roofs was passed over very mutely. And I think I can understand why some in the media would be reluctant to criticize the Eye of Sauron. For those who don't know, Palantir, the term, comes from Peter Thiel and Alex Karp's, the CEO. Peter Thiel, the principal funder and founder, and then Karp, the current CEO, who's a real freak in his own right. But their mutual obsession with Lord of the Rings, and their missing the point of the Lord of the Rings in one of the most catastrophic ways, because the Palantir is the dark orb or crystal ball that the evil enemy Sauron uses to corrupt and weaken the minds of elves and kings and so forth, as well as a tool for spying and transferring information long distance. And so Palantir has been around for a very long time now, and even, went so far as to subtly claim credit for helping the CIA to locate Osama bin Laden, which is a hilarious thing to try and take credit for, because bin Laden was living in protective custody under the control of the Pakistani ISI. He was living in essentially a government safe house in a garrison town in Pakistan, in the shadow of the country's largest military academy. And one of the more plausible explanations for why bin Laden was killed when he was because the Pakistanis needed some diplomatic cred, or someone in the very corrupt Pakistani ISI or military simply sold the secret to a CIA bidder. But that really doesn't matter now. What matters now is that Palantir is, for example, assisting ICE in the location and I'm not going to call it an arrest because you need a warrant for one of those, kidnapping, and I'm not going to call it detention because, detention usually implies like it's temporary, like for questioning, for instance, or awaiting bail or even trial. But kidnaps and imprisons and then later deports without trial immigrants suspected, not proven, not witnessed in court, but immigrants suspected of having incomplete immigration paperwork. And what is the punishment or the fate of these people who are suspected by, again, since it's a corporation handling the targeting and execution and labeling of people as suspected illegal immigrants, the Palantir algorithm, which they are running as an overlay over things like security camera and CCTV footage, analysis of traffic patterns on things like Facebook, official government records from police departments and the feds and the NSA and so forth. They are going through algorithmically and labeling different people in America as being suspected illegal immigrants, and then having those names, handing off a list of names to these fucking fat ass Gestapo motherfuckers, these donut munching fat ass Homer Simpson, Hank Hill, bigoted fascist morons in ICE. They're handing off this list of suspects, which makes Palantir something like the national immune system, which gets to label every cell in the body politic as either self, white, or not self. And we've seen what happens when you're labeled not self by the immune system. So that's Palantir. And the other arm of this techno-Hindu goddess of destruction that we are unleashing is epitomized, but in no way encompassed by the company Anduril, Anduril, ran by Lucky Palmer, a sort of be-flip-flopped Tony Stark in Iron Man 1 kind of guy. And what Anduril develops and sells are autonomous weapon systems, drones that range in size from smaller than your hand to, the size of a Predator drone. Dog robots with 44 caliber turrets mounted on their backs. Various cruise missiles and landmines and so forth. And they received very heavy investment from Peter Thiel and a venture capital firm, which also is often associated both with Peter Thiel and the CIA, called In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel being the venture capital arm of the intelligence service, and often as well the military. It's where you go if you have money for a new way to spy on cell phones, or you've invented an explosive powder that can be made into a colorless gel, and you'd like some funding for that, or you've invented a new software exploit that can break into Android phones. Where do you go to get money? In-Q-Tel. And so Anduril is creating autonomous aircraft, autonomous naval craft, and we are transitioning slowly, and this began certainly, even to say began is to give too much primacy, but really the automation of violence in the U.S. military really hit its stride under the Obama years with drone warfare and foreign policy by assassination in the drone warfare campaigns. Jeremy Scahill wrote a book called The Assassination Complex about this. And so Obama's use of drone warfare set off a funding and policy spree where more and more money, more and more R&D was allocated for autonomous weapons, and there were a bunch of reasons why. Reason number one, probably, is that the United States does not have enough people in the military to fulfill its military objective. What is its military objective? In its own words, full spectrum dominance of air, space, cyberspace, ocean, and land. A triple canopy, which is the name of a notorious mercenary firm, because associated with all of these companies are Eric Prince and Blackwater, as well as I just said, Triple Canopy. These companies tend to change their names like every 3 years. So, for example, Blackwater is not called Blackwater anymore. I don't even know what it's called, but it's changed its name several times. These entities are all connected. They are funded by similar funders. They socialize in similar circles. They obey the sorts of patterns and regularities that you see if you read, like, this is a very old-fashioned book for connoisseurs only, but the book The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills, which was an analysis of essentially Eisenhower and Kennedy-era liberals, elites, foreign policy experts, the commentariat, university professors, and so on, scientists, the kind of the top 10% of society, but then the ultimate ring of people that, for example, sit on the Council of Foreign Relations, or they're the CEO of a major bank, or the hereditary, member of like a Bush family or whatever. Those people, which all go to the same country clubs, eat at the same restaurants, travel on the same yachts, speak at the same conferences, appear in the same diplomatic rooms during world historical moments, and so on and so forth. So this cluster, the Palantir, Anduril, In-Q-Tel, CIA, NSA cluster, is the throbbing gristle at the heart of the American surveillance and control state. And it is operating quite openly and quite provocatively, in the public statements of people like Alex Karp, you hear a level of fearless assertion that is only possible in a shameless warlord Mad Max society. To me, what is terrifying about this juncture, well, actually, let me go back to the structural factors pushing for the development of autonomous weapons and the automation of violence. So first, we don't have enough people to run the planet. There are not enough Marines. There are not enough Army people to invade and occupy all the places we want to invade and occupy, which is especially why, America was so hesitant, for instance, to surge troops into Iraq or Afghanistan, is because we knew that if we increased our total theater deployment that much, that we would have serious shortages in other areas which were perceived as unstable. And another thing is that quite rightly, nobody in their proper mind or situation, I think more significantly, is signing up to join the Marines or the Air Force or whatever. There are huge problems that the military is facing in getting new recruits. The usual tactic is to send military recruiters who are very polished and very workshopped into inner city supermarkets and schools, into churches, into after-school clubs and athletics programs, and to lobby young people and poor people directly, and to offer them cash incentives to sign up in less than 24 hours, tell them an endless series of lies about how their service will work, what they'll be paid, whether or not they'll be allowed to choose their job in the military. And the military is the only option economically and socially for a certain low SES substratum of the U.S. economic pyramid. And so there's this problem with manpower. Nobody wants to sign up for working in Army intelligence after having seen the Abu Ghraib photos. Nobody wants to be a drone pilot, knowing what the United States has done with drones and having heard what actual drone pilots go through on a day-to-day basis. And so the U.S. military has had low recruitment numbers, and it's seen as a critical national security threat, our inability to recruit new people into the military. And so what can you do but replace them with machines? Another reason for the interest in developing these autonomous weapons is that it lowers or removes a barrier to the kind of low-intensity warfare which the United States is often engaging in, where you're not really at war, but you are, for example, going across the border and shooting up certain areas around the world, or going into, you're dropping out of the back of a helicopter and kicking in doors in the middle of the night in some Delta raid in a country that, if you say the name of it in the media, you'll be killed in a car crash the next week. So we don't have enough of those guys, and sometimes when you send to those guys, they get captured, and then you have to admit that it's happening, which is super embarrassing. So wouldn't it just be better if we could do the killing and the intimidation and the mayhem and murder with robots that never go off script? If we could attack a place like Yemen using nothing but Reaper drones and ordnances and cruise missiles launched from destroyers, and it allows us a level of asymmetry where we don't have to worry about our people dying or getting captured, and we can't do anything meaningful. You can't invade the country and hold it. You can't defeat an enemy military. And in the case of Yemen, they shot down like over 24 of our drones. And I have no idea what the financial value of the drones they shot down was, but yeah, I'm sure it's a fuckload of money. And so the what was once in a tongue-in-cheek way called in the 90s the increasing technological sophistication of third world militaries has now actually kind of caught up, considering that the international arms market, which the United States has done so much to protect and expand, has now grown to the point where anybody with enough money can buy a weapon that will reliably shoot down a predator drone. So there is all this pressure towards the development of autonomous killing machines at all different scales, from things that are, that have a piece of C4 the size of a pack of gum that you could put on a quadcopter, which is the size of your palm, and used to assassinate individual people, all the way up to, again, replacements for platforms like the Reaper, the Predator drone. Or even, I think I've seen Anduril developing stealth bombers, strategic bombers, capable of dropping JDAMs and larger tonnage bombs. Because, after all, why use a pilot who could fuck up or have a biological incident like a heart attack or something when you could just remote control the thing? And then worst case scenario, the thing gets shot down. You don't have to put any crying mothers on TV or deal with any lawsuits or whatever. But we have developed now a powerful regime of autonomous weaponry. We have also, I'm sure through Palantir and their collaboration with intelligence agencies and law enforcement and so forth, compiled a very long, very detailed enemies list. And all that is missing in this linkage or flow from identifying an enemy to killing the enemy is the state, whose function nominally is to serve as the stamp of approval as to who can be killed and who can't be killed. For instance, when an American citizen who was preaching radical Islamic jihad overseas was identified by the CIA as a threat to national security, they targeted that person with a Predator drone and then came to Obama and said, hey, we have this guy in our sights, and you just sign off on killing him. And Obama signed off on killing him, and so he was killed. And that process, which absolutely, that is not the first, only, or most important example of, but just an example of. The state is supposed to stand in the middle of this input of enemies and output of both selecting the kind of violence to be done, whether it's going to be a kidnapping and a deportation like we see with ICE, or whether it's going to be an assassination, whether it's going to be surveillance and blackmail. The state has served to stamp this and say, this is the violence we want, this is the legitimate violence, or no, that's going to blow back on us, we don't want to do that, or whatever. But now the final piece of the Millennium Puzzle is being assembled, which is in all this swirl of news, the description of an attempt to create a Trump AI, and where people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and so forth have lent their technological abilities, meaning their companies, to the project of developing a decision-making algorithm, which they say, of course, is modeled on Donald Trump's brilliant, mind, but is absolutely not. That is just the marketing. What it's modeled on, I'm sure, is the political philosophy of Curtis Yarvin and the financial needs of Wall Street. I'm sure that is how it is actually programmed. But following from Curtis Yarvin's dictum to retire all government employees, which we are now seeing come under direct assault by the federal government shutdown, the ideal is to replace these government bureaucracies, which, love them or hate them, create a barrier or a Thermopylaean pass through which executive power cannot always function, or corporate power cannot always function. You know, the EPA on its best days, I suppose, serves as a kind of check on the petroleum industry, or the Department of Education, which no longer exists, by the way. The Department of Education would serve as a check on the depredations of the Wall Street ran charter school system. The idea is to replace those bureaucracies with artificial intelligence. Because if you can do that, and if you own that artificial intelligence, then you are essentially puppeteering an entire government department with only, I don't know, 5 or 6 people. And that provides, I would say, a level of control. The reality is that if you do that, you will immediately personally lose control over whatever large-scale process you unleash, because no human being can manage the complexity required to surveil the operations of, you know, for instance, if you were to take the State Department and replace all of the, 800 policy analysts with LLMs, you know, just put ChatGPT on analyzing the Iranian culture of suicide bombing or whatever, instead of a real-life human being. And then, you know, make all the managers and supervisors other LLMs. I mean, people really think like this. And those people have more access to the executive than they have ever had in history. And there is this large-scale attempt to shut down liberal democracy by people who believe that they can design a technological form of government, that they can govern through algorithm, that these organs of bureaucracy and manufacture of consent and representation are inefficiencies that jam and frustrate long-term plan, you know, whatever. Like, we've all heard at this point now an unbelievable amount of anti-democratic rhetoric. I don't even need to summarize it for you. But we are entering a technological grid, I'll say, a new plateau upon which we have the automation of surveillance, which leads to the automation of, I was looking for a verb there, but to make one an enemy, to label as an enemy. So automated surveillance leads to the automated labeling of a person as an enemy, leading to an automated selection of response, and then the execution of that response through autonomous weapons systems or through more semantic forms of harassment like Twitter troll armies or hate mail or whatever, as well as the automation of propaganda. For example, Trump tweeting an AI-generated photo of the quote-unquote Gaza Riviera filled with jaw-droppingly disgusting images of himself and Benjamin Netanyahu reclining half-naked poolside in what they imagine will be the Trump Tower of Gaza City, and other endless, nauseating political absurdities. And then, of course, the automation of the administration of the fallout of all of those decisions, and the automation of planning. And planning in particular for what you could call, and what has been called by its own designers, the Society of Perpetual Advantage. This term, the Society of Perpetual Advantage, is a term that I draw from the State Department Foreign Policy Planner George Kennan and his remarkable memo, PPS 23, which I will link in the description, and which I reference frequently, because there is in this memo the answer, the honesty, the true form of American foreign policy. And I draw the term, the Society of Perpetual Advantage, from what he instead calls maintaining a position of disparity. So let me read from this planning document, which was written after World War II and essentially goes region by region in setting what he believes should be the contours of U.S. imperial objectives. And this is just 2 paragraphs from the section entitled The Far East. So he's talking about what U.S. policy should be in relation to China, Vietnam, which was then Indochina, Japan, etc. So, quote, "Furthermore, we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security." I'm going to read that one more time. "Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity, which is having 50% of the world's wealth and 6.3% of its population, without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. For these reasons, we must observe a great restraint in our attitude towards the Far Eastern areas. The peoples of Asia and of the Pacific area are going to go ahead, whatever we do, with the development of their political forms and mutual interrelationships in their own way. This process cannot be a liberal or peaceful one. The greatest of the Asiatic peoples, the Chinese and the Indians, have not yet even made a beginning at the solution of the basic demographic problem involved in the relationship between their food supply and their birth rate. Until they find some solution to this problem, further hunger, distress, and violence are inevitable. All of the Asiatic peoples are faced with the necessity for evolving new forms of life to conform to the impact of modern technology. This process of adaptation will also be long and violent. It is not only possible but probable that in the course of this process many peoples will fall for varying periods under the influence of Moscow, whose ideology has a greater lure for such people, and probably greater reality, than anything we could oppose to it. All this, too, is probably unavoidable, and we could not hope to combat it without the diversion of a far greater portion of our national effort than our people would ever willingly concede to such a purpose. In other words, and now I'm taking an aside to paraphrase, the poor people of the world, if allowed their own liberty, would choose to go with the Soviet Union because it really would be better for them. And we must project power far enough away from where we are, using money that our own population would not give us if they know the truth, in order to prevent this from happening. All right, now he continues. In the face of this situation, we would be better off to dispense now with a number of the concepts which have underlined our thinking with regard to the Far East. We should dispense with the aspiration to be liked, or to be regarded as the repository of a high-minded international altruism. We should stop putting ourselves in the position of being our brother's keeper and refrain from offering moral and ideological advice. We should cease to talk about vague and, for the Far East, unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. the less we are hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. Those 3 paragraphs will become the operating system that runs the core of the future American empire's foreign policy machine.
I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace.
And then the world was hit by a new kind of crisis.
My version of what's going to happen in the next 10 years is, or even 5, is 86% of the value of market cap of the top 50 companies are U.S. And then on the battlefield and in commercial, deploying AI, I think people somehow still don't quite understand. And I think the power.
Don't understand what?
How much it's going to change the relative GDP of America compared to, say, our allies. Like, I think it was 61 to 92, rough. France's GDP grew faster than America's. Can anyone imagine any European country having a GDP even half as strong as America will have in the next 5 years, and let alone next 20 years? And then you have the battlefield is going to be AI and smaller weapons driven, and the almost complete tech scene for that is in this country.
You consider that soft power, economic power?
Well, no, I think
what
the hard.
Is that in?
No, I think the hard power is going to be so dominant